You ever have a guilty pleasure game? A game you know is, well, a bit subpar, but you keep coming back to it for some reason? I guess you could say Glover was my guilty pleasure game. I'm not too sure why, but something about this game continues to fascinate me. Perhaps something about its weirdness resonates with me, or maybe I'm just a masochist. Personal taste aside, however, it's kinda hard to argue against the claim that this game had some surprising longevity. Glover has somehow achieved a bit of a status of infamy, and continues to spark discussion even to this day. But why? At first glance, there's nothing particularly noteworthy about this game. Its gameplay is simplistic, its visuals average. Yet of all the mediocre mascot platformers of the era, this one just refuses to be forgotten. Now, I have a little theory to share with you all today. A hypothesis, if you will, as to why the Talking Mitten continues to live on. You see, Glover took a different approach from the competition. It took established best practices of early 3D platformers and, well, basically threw them all out the window. Glover is effectively the antithesis of Super Mario 64, the golden standard that 3D platformers originated from. Its unique, if not cumbersome, approach is what led it to being so memorable. Now, let's back it up a bit here. Super Mario 64 was the game changer when it first came out. This game set the standard for how games handle in a 3D space. It introduced fluid movement and tight controls, all handled with a mostly responsive camera system that other developers would struggle with to this very day. All of this was bundled up in a mix of believable and whimsical environments that the player was encouraged to explore. Collecting things was such a big deal, it spawned its own genre, the Collectathon. Mario 64's undeniable success sparked a major rise in 3D mascot platformers, each taking their own unique approach to get a slice of the plumber's pie. Everyone wanted to come up with their own wacky character and gimmicks to take on the unbeatable Super Mario. For example, some games like Banjo-Kazooie focused on stronger presentation, with a more detailed game world. Other platformers like Spyro the Dragon put greater emphasis on aesthetics and an extremely tight game loop. Then came Glover, a glove with a face on it, and he did something completely different. What's funny about this game is, unlike its competition that tried to emulate Super Mario 64, Glover took the strongest element of Super Mario 64, its fluid controls, and made them bad. Intentionally. You see, in Glover 64, you don't just run and jump around as you please. Oh no. You're almost constantly linked to a large ball, the uses of which is required to progress through and beat a level. And you only have partial control of this thing. The bouncy ball is as much a tool as it is a liability. You're at the mercy of every piece of level geometry, every slope or slight bend in the path is potential doom. Remember that if the ball dies, you die, and having to let go of the ball is a mandatory and always nerve-wracking experience. And this game is brutally difficult. Other 3D platformers of the time could not even come close to this level of difficulty. Horrific traps and tight platforming littered each game world, with very little room for mistakes. It wasn't even intended for a mature audience. The majority of this game's players were clueless kids who probably rented it from Blockbuster. Finding someone who actually beat the game without cheat codes is a rare thing. I'll admit, even I am guilty of it back in the day. This is the polar opposite of Super Mario 64, which put a great amount of focus on accessibility, easing players into more difficult areas as they progressed. The level design is also completely inverted. Super Mario 64 generally focused on open, pseudo-believable environments like fields and mountains, with the random stuff floating in the sky aesthetic showing up on occasion. The lack of instant death pits gave players some leeway when they screw up, letting them try again rather than fall to their deaths and eventually get a game over. Glover 64, however, mostly takes place on tiny misshapen platforms floating above lava or worse, the void. These cramped, fidgety courses meant the player was given no wiggle room in the event of a screw-up, which is gonna happen more often than not, especially due to the jank that pops up in the later levels. Exploration is also almost completely cut out in favor of linear platforming and progression. While the game itself is actually quite short, the high difficulty level really extended the playtime. Another polar opposite is how the games handle their cameras. Player view in 3D platforming has always been a fickle creature to say the least. Super Mario 64's camera was pretty damn good considering it pioneered the practice. While it did a decent enough job at following you around, the levels were always structured in such a way that you didn't have to spend a whole lot of time reorienting yourself. Level geometry generally positioned itself so that your view was clear and you could gauge jumps. Glover, on the other hand, hoo boy. The camera here does the herky-jerky, constantly swinging about and forcing you to adjust your course. Most of the levels use extremely open plans with little to no walls, most likely to keep the camera from getting stuck on things. Whenever things do get a bit tight, however, you'll usually switch to a top-down view. To assist with lobbing the ball around, the developers actually added a handy trajectory visualizer that will show you where the ball is going to end up once you toss it. This mostly works. It's definitely a lot more manual than more subtle techniques granted by other platformers, but it fits in nicely, it gets the job done. Speaking of fitting in, let's talk a bit about the character design here. Mascot platformers weren't a trend, they were an arms race. Everyone was attempting to develop the next Sonic or Mario, with a huge upsurge in furries ruling the gaming scene for a while. Super Mario 64's enemies' designs focused on the familiar, paying homage to earlier titles while developing a few original ones as well. Meanwhile, if you want a taste of Glover's design philosophy, look no further than the handy hero himself. Glover's protagonist is, the hamburger helper. The character designs here almost feel like some sort of inside joke. I mean, they're obvious enough. The dinosaur land has dinosaurs, the space land has aliens, but it feels like I'm missing something here. Just look at the prehistoric boss, a frozen dinosaur wearing sunglasses, sneakers, and a dynamite backpack. While I'm glad he's in there and I'm out here, whatever reference they're trying to make is a bit lost on me. The horror boss looks like he just finished up the Monster Mash. All the characters look like they're from the same game, but the designs tend to have strange deformities or just weird quirks that give the game an almost demented flair. While Mario 64 focused on more agreeable designs the player would be familiar with, Glover was foreign, with strange visuals that were almost uncomfortable to look at. Now, while it seems like the main contrast here is Mario good, Glover bad, it's a bit more complex than that. Glover's overall design turns back the clock, structured like a challenging 2D platformer awkwardly thrusted into the third dimension. This was back when the rules of 3D gaming were still being figured out, and Glover was forging a path of its own. Sure, it did use some standardized set pieces like a hub world, but even there it did something new, with the overworld progressively becoming more pleasant as you made progress against the game's primary antagonist. Really, the thing with Glover is, despite the lower budget, it really is packed to the brim with imagination. You can really tell the devs had some big ideas here. Just look at the backgrounds for these level scorecards. The idea of these fantastic worlds hidden amongst the clouds, it's really freaking cool to be honest. Also, as a bit of a side note, the soundtrack is fantastic, and you have to give it a listen sometime. Rather than try to copy what made Mario 64 good, Glover went and tried to find its own identity. And that's what made it stand out compared to the endless amounts of shovelware pushed onto the N64 console. You know, what's also interesting is that there was actually a Glover 2 that got extremely far into development before getting cancelled. What's even more interesting about this is you can run out and play the full prototype if you want to. Well, I won't be going into too much detail about it here. It's worth noting that the sequel was going to be a lot more like its competition. Following the trend of the gen's later 3D platformers, it sported more realistic environments with more emphasis on minigames and quests for NPCs. Whether this approach would have enhanced or ruined the franchise, well, we can only theorize, as the franchise was sadly sunk long ago. Back to my earlier hypothesis, Glover 64 took the precedent set by Super Mario 64 and completely flipped it on its head. Between the intentionally clunky methods of control, the inaccessible difficulty, and the demented visual design, Glover ended up standing out amongst the sea of mascot platformers striving to swipe the plumber's thunder. While it's definitely a product of its era, and I don't think we'll be getting a Glover remaster anytime soon, it was an interesting experiment that could potentially be revisited in the future. Glover is horrifically difficult, completely nonsensical, and as linear as it gets, and that's how it stood the test of time. Where the platformer revolution was centered around giving the player control over a character in 3D space, Glover is about taking away a bit of this control, intentionally being obtuse for the sake of unique platforming mechanics. Its commitment to its own ideas and aesthetic were why the game was remembered. For better or for worse. And I know what you're all thinking. I just railed on the game's issues for like 10 minutes. How doesn't this make this game bad? Well, it just doesn't. In my opinion, the biggest sin a game can make is being boring, being forgettable. While the game was mechanically a mixed bag, it was also weird, colorful, and creative. As time marches on and more games are inevitably forgotten, it's going to be the games that make you feel something that are going to be continuously talked about. As Glover shows us, it's better to be weird and frustrating than bland and inoffensive. Now, the saddest part of the story of the little glove that could is that Glover 2 was cancelled. Effectively twice. Despite this setback, I can't help but feel as though we haven't yet seen the last of this weird little dude. When he probably comes back, I certainly hope he retains the charm that made him noteworthy in the first place. In all honesty, I think the cultural perception of difficult games has changed quite a bit since the N64 days, and a spiritual successor to Glover could really thrive in this environment. Nothing we can do now, though, except wait and see. And that's all for today. Thanks everyone for checking me out. If you like what you see, make sure to subscribe. I have a whole lot of games to discuss, and we've only just got started. Until next time, see ya!